Good evening, everybody. I hope you're doing well. It's nice to see you here. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to hang out with us tonight. Couple of housekeeping items before I hand it over to Dr. Myers for introductions. We are in a Zoom meeting, so please just keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question, or else we will all hear you. But we do absolutely encourage questions and comments during the session. So there's a couple of ways to do that. We have the Q&A feature. That's a great place to put your specific questions to our presenter today. That ensures us we can really help keep track of those and make sure they get responded to. And then the chat, you can chat amongst yourself. You can throw comments in there for us. That's totally fine as well. So those are the two ways you can communicate. And of course, when we come to the Q&A part of the presentation, you're also welcome to come off mute and ask your question live. We are recording this session, so if you would like to check it out at a later date, or you know someone who missed it and then wanted to be here, do let them know, but we will be recording that and getting the recording out to you as well. But on that note, I will hand it over to Dr. Myers.
Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sherri Leahy. Dr. Leahy is from North Central University. She's an alum, and she's also a part-time assistant professor with the School of Health Professions. Her healthcare leadership background includes over 25 years of operational experience and executive roles leading strategic projects designed to remain competitive in today's complex healthcare environment. Her industry experience in a variety of healthcare settings includes quality improvement, patient safety, patient experience, care coordination, and health information management. With a deep understanding and expertise in high reliability organization models, Dr. Leahy led health system board governance and leadership teams to commit to zero patient harm, a fully functional culture of safety, and use of robust process improvement methods. As vice president in the third largest healthcare delivery system in Illinois, Dr. Leahy is a practitioner and scholar leading efforts to create a safe environment for patients and designing consistent practices and processes that have safe, proven outcomes. Dr. Leahy received her bachelor's degree in nursing from Jamestown University, her master's in organizational development from Loyola in Chicago, and a PhD in organizational psychology from North Central University. Dr. Leahy, welcome to our IPE seminar, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk to all of us about highly reliable organizations.
Thank you so much for your warm introduction, and thank you all for joining today. It's so nice to see your faces, and I see one of my current students, so I feel right at home here. So it's great to see all of you. And that was a very long bio. I need to edit that. But the bottom line is I'm a nurse, and I'm very passionate about patient safety and high reliability. So I hope I can share some of that with you today. So what I'm going to do is just queue up my presentation. Give me 1 minute. Actually, I want to share. And I'm hoping you can see this.
Looks great.
Everybody can see it? Great. So yes, the topic today is high reliability. And, you know, I could probably speak about this for hours, but I promise that I won't. I'm hoping to spend about 40 minutes on content and then just to get enough time with you to answer some of your questions, because this is a really interesting topic and really relevant in today's world to both nurses and to healthcare leaders, healthcare administration. This really is something that's on top of mind for a lot of people. So my content today, I'm going to go over a bit of a background, so hang in there with me so I can give you some context about high reliability. And I am going to touch on some theory and some principles that, you know, you always want to understand why you're doing the things that you do. And there is quite a bit of theory around high reliability. And then finally, how to apply that to healthcare, and not only to healthcare organizations, but even to your own professional practice, whether you are working in a hospital or other healthcare environment. I feel that all these things can be applied. And then we'll stop. If there are questions, I'm happy to pause and answer any questions that you might have, even in the middle of this. So my aim really is to give you some, as I said, some practical applications. I'm a pretty practical person. And although I love the literature and what can be learned, I want to always know how I can translate that into my own practice and be a better practitioner and scholar practitioner based on that information. So I will do that. But most importantly, I really want to spark your curiosity, because there is a lot more to know, a lot more to consider, a lot more to experience around high reliability. And as you listen to me, I'm not an expert, that's for sure, just very passionate about this. But as you listen to me, keep thinking, I wonder what would happen if I did this, or what if I did that? Or how would it look like, or what would it be like? That there are some principles, and I'd love for you just to think about what it might look like in your own life, and how you might translate these things into your life. So we're going to start with background, and the background is a name and a face. And some of this may be already things that you're aware of, but maybe not. So the name is Challenger. And if you're an older individual like I am, you might remember when the Challenger disaster actually occurred in 1986. And if you do remember, you probably remember where you were and what you were doing, because it was that kind of disaster and that kind of event. So for those of you who are too young and don't remember, the Challenger disaster was the 25th flight of the space shuttle fleet. And it was the first ever to include a civilian school teacher, Krista McAuliffe. And this, because she was a school teacher, this was broadcast live, not only on television, but in schoolrooms, on television sets in schoolrooms. So children, as she was a school teacher, were watching this. And as you probably know, after takeoff, the space shuttle broke apart after 73 seconds into the flight while it was being broadcast on live TV, killing all 7 crew members. And that smoke spiral is what you actually saw as the news reporters were trying to explain what had happened. This video is actually on YouTube, and I watched it recently, as I was preparing for this presentation, and I had the same gut reaction to this disaster. I'm watching it all these years later. There's really no words can describe how that must have felt if you were a child watching this happen. But as a result of this disaster, NASA established the Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance. And there was, of course, a great deal of analysis and thought about what went wrong, what happened. And the popular idea was that an O-ring seal failed during launch in cold weather. It wasn't behaving the same way as in warm weather. And the engineers apparently had tried very hard to communicate this to the NASA hierarchy, but unsuccessful, and the launch went on. And so this has been used as a case study for engineering, ethics, and communication. And I was telling this story just recently to a group of staff in the hospital here. And one of the nurses spoke up and said that her father was actually an engineer on this Challenger case. And she remembers how upset and sad and devastated the engineers were, and her dad, that no one had listened to them. So it was almost like a response of failure from the engineers who weren't ever heard. So the Challenger disaster, keep that in mind. This does provide some context to high reliability, but it was the very first really terrible thing that happened with the space shuttle fleet. And then this one you're probably more familiar with, and I'm hoping that everyone is, and everyone has discussed this at some point or another. But last year around this time, this hit the news again, and this is the case of Reluctance, Vaught, who committed a medication error. The patient's name, and this is the name, Charlene Murphy, died in a hospital. It was Vanderbilt University Hospital, actually, after receiving a dose of vecuronium rather than Versed. And as a result of this situation, it was just a comedy of errors. Terrible things happened. Reluctance Vaught was terminated and then eventually convicted on 2 counts in the death of this patient. So this created a lot of discussion among nursing professions. And of course, the American Nurses Association came out with a statement saying that this was a very dangerous precedent. And, when you really came down to look at this, course, root causes were conducted, and there were things, and you probably have discussed this, that the nurse did that were error, I would say, over things that she overlooked and shortcuts that she took that did contribute to the error. But there were many systemic failures at Vanderbilt that also occurred that enabled her to make this error. So if you're really interested, you can Google the CMS survey that actually occurred on October 31st, 2018, when the CMS surveyors descended upon Vanderbilt Hospital. 52 pages of their findings are on the internet. And basically, their bottom line was, and this is to quote, the hospital failed to mitigate risks associated with medication errors, placing patients in immediate jeopardy. So not sure if any of you are in the world of quality like I am, but the words immediate jeopardy basically means they're going to shut down your hospital unless you do something. So it's a terrible thing. So, Renata did things like overrode the Pyxis dispensing machine. And however, things that happened in the hospital, no medication scanner in the room, and lots of interruptions and things that shouldn't have happened. So this is also a great case to study in terms of, how did the error occur, and what were all the causal factors that were happening on the part of the hospital. So then there's one more third thing that happened. And back in 2003, there was another space shuttle disaster. The Columbia space shuttle fell apart or exploded during re-entry after a space mission. All of the astronauts were killed in this one as well. But this is right out of an accident investigation report from 2003 that happened shortly after. And I really don't like to read PowerPoint slides, but I have to read a couple pieces of this for you, because this is what the bottom line was. And think in terms of healthcare as I'm reading this, but here it's saying many accident investigations make the same mistake. They identify the widget that broke or malfunctioned and then locate the person most closely connected with that technical failure. So that's the engineer who miscalculated, or the operator who missed the signals and pulled the wrong switches, or the supervisor who failed to listen. So when causal chains are limited to technical flaws and individual failures, the responses aimed at preventing a similar event in the future are equally limited. They aim to fix the technical problem and replace or retrain the individual responsible. And this can really lead to a disastrous belief that the underlying problem has been solved. So this is not anything about healthcare, but it's basically talking about the frame of reference that you were having at the time about how things happen and how they are corrected, how things are corrected, up to and including identifying the person most closely connected to the failure. So that's background for you, because there are lessons that can be extrapolated from Challenger and the nurse Vaught. When you really think about it, adverse events occur within complex systems. We know that from looking at both of these cases. When we focus on people, mistakes, technical things, we may not address the complex system in which these things occur. And the organizational culture, and hopefully you've learned a little bit about that, but beliefs, assumptions, and biases all are part of the things that complicate already complex systems. So the bottom line with Challenger and with Vaught is that an ineffective safety culture contributed to the errors and harm in both of these cases. And high reliability nowadays is often considered a means to reduce these adverse events. So again, the message and the bottom line is these things are very complicated, and maybe high reliability is something that we should learn more about, which we're going to learn more about. So moving on to kind of theory, nothing is as good and practical as a good theory. So maybe you've heard this famous quote. You always want to see where the theoretical foundation lies. So there's plenty of it in high reliability. And high reliability theory, basically, it's been around for decades, basically goes into ideas that accidents are going to happen, that they're happening, and they're an ongoing burden socially and economically. And high reliability theory posits that organizations can contribute to the prevention of accidents by implementing reliability enhancing strategies. So even if you think, oh, this is going to occur, there's always going to be the potential for an accident. Accidents happen. High reliability theory will say, well, you can do things about that to prevent those accidents. So high reliability theory is seen as really important and a possible safety paradigm in industries and organizations that are, maybe you've heard of this, VUCA-T, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and possibly threatening. So does that sound a little bit like healthcare? It does to me, especially the T lately. But these are organizations that might really be well off to look at high reliability theory. So VUCA-T industries, typically when we think of it, we think of nuclear power, commercial aviation, air traffic control, military operations. These are all very complicated and complex systems behind these organizations. So if an accident occurs at a nuclear power plant, well, that could be catastrophic, just like the space shuttle disaster. So VUCA-T industries are very interested, have been very interested in high reliability theory. And again, those VUCA-T characteristics, you can kind of take a look at them right there. They are industries that are very, very complex, lots of systems and processes. There's a lot of tight coupling, and tight coupling means that people are connected. There's a lot of interdependence across many processes. It's not just one person working independently. There's people working together. There's also lots of hierarchy, multiple levels. There are lots of people involved in making decisions and complex communication. And this one is very important. There's a very large degree of accountability that exists in a VUCA-T organization, where in that substantial performance or deviations from standard procedures could result in very severe adverse consequences. So an error could be catastrophic, basically. And then finally, compressed timeframes, that lots of things happen very quickly, decisions have to be made on the fly, and things happen before you even know it. So those are things to keep in mind. Just high reliability in industries in general have these VUCA-T characteristics and could really help by looking at high reliability. So there's one book that you might want to add to your library. I would recommend it. This is just really a foundational book written in 2007 that took the idea of high reliability theory and translated it into a set of principles that organizations could actually use to maybe start down that road for high reliability. Because how do you do that? High reliability theory definitely has to be translated into how do we now apply it. So there are 5 principles that were outlined in this book by Wyke and Sutcliffe. Preoccupation with failure, sensitivity to operations, reluctance to simplify, commitment to resilience, deference to expertise. I'll go through each of those to maybe you've heard of them, but I'll go through each of them so that you can kind of get a feel for what that means. So what they're saying is high reliability is preoccupied with failure, in that people are aware of and thinking about the potential for failure. That's always top of mind. Knowing that things are going to happen, you think about the fact that things are going to happen. And then not only that, you understand that new threats that you may not even know about, can't even imagine about, could occur, and add to the complication in that things might fail. So I like this, the third bullet point, basically the absence of errors does not lead to complacency. So just because nothing bad is happening doesn't mean that nothing bad is ever going to happen. And you're just not complacent in that, oh, we don't have, terrible medical errors here because we've got a great culture of safety, but you really never know. So absence of errors is not leading to complacency, and near misses are opportunities to improve. So near misses are really super important when you're being preoccupied with failure. So the first principle is this: being preoccupied with failure. The second is reluctance to simplify. And maybe, you are already aware of how often people do this. People just simply don't get into how complicated work, especially in healthcare, work is, and how many processes are behind the work that we do and impacting why things succeed or fail. So there needs to be an understanding that work is complex and dynamic, that people really seek to understand the underlying rather than surface explanations, and that people to address this recognize the value of standardizing workflows and reducing variation. So reluctance to simplify means, look beyond the surface and know that there's a lot going on underneath that. Sensitivity to operations is the third principle. And this one also you may have heard of. People strive to maintain awareness of all the operational conditions that are impacting the work that is being done. This is sometimes called big picture understanding, situational awareness, and people to be sensitive to operations really try to look at everything that's happening around a process and how people are contributing to what's going on in that process. So a bit more about that later, but understanding the context of the current state of the work environment requires effort and time to really understand. Sometimes people make rounds to do that, to try to talk to people so that they can understand and be sensitive. Deferring to expertise, deference to expertise. This is a principle that talks to people who are closest to the work are the most knowledgeable about the work. And I hope you've heard about this before, maybe even experienced this in your own life. They talk about the sharp end, the blunt end and the sharp end, but the people at the sharp end closest to patients or closest to work, they're the ones oftentimes that are the most knowledgeable. They have the greatest knowledge, but they may not be the person in the highest level status or seniority. They might be someone who's, you never really know. It could be someone who's a housekeeper in the room watching, or in a room or in a process knowing what's going on. So you really don't know unless you consider deferring to expertise. Who are the people that might be able to contribute to an analysis of an event that might happen? So people in organizations that are highly reliable are expected to share concerns about potential safety problems. So deferring to expertise means the person in the highest level position probably doesn't know the most about the process. And lastly, this is my favorite, commitment to resilience. And this is just the fundamental understanding that things are unpredictable and that we just assume that things are at risk for failure. And so we try to create situations or practice or do drills so that people know how to respond to issues and mitigate harm if necessary, if there's a safety event. So being resilient there's a lot in the literature about this lately, and hopefully you'll be able to read some of those articles and gain a better understanding about that for sure. So how do we take this high reliability theory and now make it into a high reliability organization? So that's the next step in the translation. And if you go a step further with what does it mean to be a highly reliable organization? Again, this is nothing new. The research goes back to the late 1980s when a group of scholars started to study organizations that operated accident-free in very hazardous environments where you would expect accidents to happen, but for some reason they didn't. And what made those organizations special? And that's where the term high reliability organizations came from, because those organizations had a very distinctive culture of reliability, something that made them special and different. And they started to study this and try to understand what was the secret sauce, what was the special factor that helped members of that organization become highly reliable, and even what was the autonomy and competence that they had that was different to help them respond to and correct problems. So this is where there's lots of reading. I'm not recommending these books, but there are so many books, so many articles that you can really, if you want to read about how people have implemented high reliability in organizations, you can. And I'll even add that if you're thinking about healthcare, both the Joint Commission and the Institute for Healthcare Improvement have their own papers and their own models, but there's a lot that has been written in the last 20 years, that's for sure. But I'm going to distill it into just a couple of slides, all of this. So basically, all these books are coming to the same conclusion that research has led to the realization that errors are primarily the result of process or system flaws. rather than people flaws. And I'm sure you've heard this before. People don't generally make mistakes or true errors without some type of process behind them that allow that to happen. So an HRO succeeds in avoiding errors in an environment where errors can be expected. Due to complexity and risk factors, they have become successful in creating processes and systems that prevent these errors. So all of the research and the publications that you might read will basically say that that you have been on a journey to become an HRO when you can achieve relatively error-free performance consistently over time while operating in a complex, high-risk, or hazardous environment. So how you do that and what the outcomes are the subject of many, as I said, articles and books. But they all do talk about human error, and this has been really since 1999 when the Institute of Medicine talked about to err is human. And what they said at that time, of course, everyone has the potential to commit an error, and errors include slips, lapses, and mistakes. Things slightly different than a violation. A violation is really non-compliance, circumventions, shortcuts, workarounds to policies and procedures. So variation is not the same as human error, but human error is generally the result of flawed processes. And importantly, systems or processes that depend on perfect human performance are inherently flawed. So if there's a policy or a procedure or some kind of protocol that depends on people to do it perfectly, it's probably not going to happen. And then this diagram I like because it really shows how in industry, all of these processes are contributing to an incident. And that if we want to be reluctant to simplify things, we're looking at all of these different basic system places where flaws could occur. So the external environment, the internal environment, organizational factors, management, operational staff, all of these human factors, all of these things come together and allow or prevent, but often allow an incident to happen. So keep this picture in mind because I'm going to show you something in a minute to see what you think about it. But it's helping me to remember that, okay, you're not just looking at the incident, you're going back and looking at all of those things that back up to the incident, including the external environment. So looking at this in terms of high reliability organizations, this is where we're going with basically all of this background is that high reliability in healthcare now is very interesting. There's little of the foundational research that was applied in healthcare, but there's now a very sizable interest in applying it to healthcare. So and this is because healthcare is really now having the same VUCA-T kind of characteristics that we talked about earlier. And there's about 20 years of research. So it's been a while. So 20 years of research in healthcare about high reliability. And just, again, some thoughts about how it is really uncertain, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and threatening. I'm sure you've been reading about or heard about just workplace violence issues. There's not a day goes by in my healthcare organization that there isn't a report of violence against healthcare workers within the hospital setting. So, these things happen, and especially with COVID and all the things that have contributed to really novel challenges that have required us to make so many changes. This is something that's very important out of healthcare. And so this you've all seen, I'm sure, a million times. And if you think about that picture that I just showed you with the arrow and the incident, doesn't that look a little bit like this? So we've always been thinking about the system, the system failures that could occur for patient safety accidents or patient safety issues. Each of those slices of Swiss cheese representing a factor that needs to be considered, and the holes lining up to allow errors to occur. So this is adapted from James Reason and over 20 years ago. So something that if you haven't seen, you definitely want to see and read more about. But the idea is that highly reliability principles can help us examine all these slices of the Swiss cheese and then develop mechanisms to compensate for human error, hopefully. So in the research and what's been looked at in healthcare, adopting these principles should really help us develop a system that will perform more reliably and help providers minimize defects in their care, better consistency in their care, and improve patient outcomes. So the bottom line is understanding why an error happened and examining the systems and processes before asking who made the mistake or what was, what was the individual person who was involved. That happens later. A really nice way to look at this, I think, is to look at the 5 principles on the left and then resulting on the right to high reliability and exceptionally safe, consistent, and high quality care. But there's something in the middle that we haven't talked about yet, and I want to touch on it briefly, and that's mindfulness. And mindfulness, there's been a lot in the literature lately about mindfulness, but when it's applied to high reliability, really basically means that taken together, the 5 principles can really help produce a collective state of mindfulness. If we use those 5 principles and think about things with that perspective, it will help us be mindful of the different dimensions of high reliability and have an enhanced ability to discover and correct errors that could escalate into a crisis. So mindfulness really just means it's the practice of an ongoing present moment awareness. And this contributes to the culture. Now, the Joint Commission has set out 6 core elements of just culture, of patient safety culture. These are the elements, but ideally, it's a culture that continuously learns about how to do better, how to improve processes. So these are some of the things that they claim are important. Of course, promoting safety is top priority, teamwork, open communication, rewarding individuals. All of these things are important. And each organization has a different culture, has its own unique culture, and it's important to think of that. So I like to look at it this way, that mindfulness is kind of at the center of everything, and then you're thinking in terms of preoccupation with failure, deferring to expertise, reluctance to simplify, commitment to resilience, and then that creates the culture around all of that. So these things all kind of go together to create high reliability in healthcare. So just a little bit now about applying it in your life and applying it maybe in your organization, some of these things. So, and considering what the culture might look like. So once again, just kind of look at the 5 principles, preoccupation with failure. And here in the cartoon, you've got a car speeding around a cliff, and the driver is saying, wow, that was close, we almost died. And the passenger is saying, wow, that was close, glad we had good brakes. So a culture of high reliability sees near misses as an invitation to improve, rather than proof that the system has enough checks and balances to prevent a failure. So saying, oh, thank goodness we have good brakes, maybe that is now going to lead to complacency, where the driver says, oh my goodness, we almost died. This was serious. We need to do something about it. So that's another example of how you might be thinking if you want to be preoccupied with failure. So the application of that would be, as an individual, you might be always thinking about what could go wrong in this situation. If you're in a work environment, what might be a safety break or somewhere where a defect could occur and lead to a bad outcome. If you're a nursing leader or a healthcare leader, you want to destigmatize failure, encourage reporting of errors, encourage reporting that it's a good thing, not a bad thing. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And there still is a stigma around accidents and failures that people make. I'm sure you've heard of the Kimberly Hyatt case. This was a medication error that occurred a while back, and second victim work came out of that because this nurse, having made an error, committed suicide. And there is a lot of stigma around making errors still, I think, in healthcare. So value near misses, because these are opportunities to learn and encourage others to think of ways their work might potentially break down. And if you think about it in that way, you're actually applying that principle. And here we have reluctance to simplify. Here's in a cartoon, you could see there's a button on the left, push for service. So it looks pretty simple, right? There's a button, all you have to do is push it for service. But it's not really ringing a bell. If you look within, there's all kinds of what's that called? Mousetrap kind of game where things are happening. And then finally on the far right is the bell that rings, but all these things have to happen to ring the bell. So reluctance to simplify is a culture where everyone understands the complex ways in which a system may fail. So just pushing the button for service, a lot of different things might happen that would keep that from ringing the bell. And the way you might apply it in your own life or in your own professional practice, ask more questions, challenge assumptions, look for a root cause. A complex environment requires complex challenges. So avoid being simplistic and, be aware of cognitive bias as well. Things are way more complicated than they seem, especially in healthcare. So you can think like that and really be applying high reliability just in your own practice. Sensitivity to operations. Here is in the cartoon, you have a patient in a bed and all kinds of things happening, different people, different pieces of equipment, different time constraints happening there. And really, this is just being aware again of the broader issues that may impact a patient's care, ranging from how long a nurse or someone has been on duty to the availability of supplies to potential distractions. All of that is happening. And you can actually apply that by constantly thinking about the front line, where the work gets done, how you might break down silos, how you might encourage speaking up. Very important to have people feel the psychological safety to speak up if they see a safety concern or have a safety concern, and just encouraging open communications. And then we have deferring to expertise. And in this cartoon, you've got people from different disciplines. Looks like a doctor, a pharmacist, maybe a nurse, maybe a social worker. They're all gathered around a patient's bed, and they're all making their observations about that patient. And the culture really would recognize and value the knowledge that's available from each person and defer to whoever's expertise is most relevant. In this case, it might be the social worker. She's upset about going home, and that's the real bottom line. So it may not be medications, it may not be another condition, but the way that we might apply this is to push decision-making down to the front line, give people the authority to speak up and to others to listen and seek advice from those frontline staff, and break down hierarchy. And again, some of this happens with making rounds and really knowing who's closest to these processes. And then finally, resilience. Just quickly, this picture is a boater, and he's in the water. And a good boater never leaves the dock without preparing for many situations that are unlikely but possible. So, what if the boat overturns and he's got a life jacket to mitigate that issue? And what if the engine fails and all of these things that might happen? He's got an oar to help him row the boat. So you're always thinking about what might happen. So culture is something that really will reflect resilience if that's there in the organization. So now I want to just move into something that we did here in the healthcare system where I work, and we applied these principles to fall prevention. And fall prevention is a really big deal in any healthcare environment, and lots of issues with falls, especially post-COVID in acute care settings. So this is something that you might want to do if you have the ability to be involved in analyzing these types of incidents. But we took the principles, we put them on the left, and then we took how we might apply those principles in this particular case. So you can see we identified things that we wanted to make sure that we didn't miss. So looking at reporting near misses and conducting rounds and considering environmental conditions and encouraging resilience by emphasizing working together. So there is a way of being mindful of these principles by just basically looking at how you might apply these things and really practice high reliability in any organization, whether that organization thinks it's a highly reliable organization or not. You can do this. So 8 things that you can do. These are things that you could do no matter where you work. Now, in my health organization, there are 9 hospitals. 3 of the 9 have been on a journey to high reliability for 7 years. The others have not and don't know how to go about doing it. So these are things that any individual working in those organizations can do to start on that journey to high reliability and help their organization maybe see the value of that. So again, no matter where you are, you might want to think about these things. And of course, my favorite is speaking up for safety. And one of the cultural differences in this organization where I'm working is anybody that works here can say, I have a safety concern. And then that just kind of stops everything. People know that if someone says, I have a safety concern, that's a serious thing, stops everything from happening. It's like throwing down the red flag. And basically, we then go on from there to see what's going on. And then finally, just very briefly, how do we measure high reliability? How do we know if there's high reliability? And this is an area I'm not spending a lot of time on it because there is really a lack of consensus, not only in the industry, but in the literature about how do you measure high reliability? How do you know that it's working? How do you know that if you do this transition or try to make this investment and develop this culture, that it's working? So the most of the scholars will agree that it really does help to change thinking about patient safety. So high reliability and the theory and the behaviors and the culture really goes to changing patient safety to a very positive and something that people are focused on and have increased awareness about for sure. But then there are also some relevant measures that we could look at. We do look at serious safety events, adverse drug events, indicators of treatment failures, even hospital readmissions. There's lots of things that you might say are related to high reliability endeavors. And then this is an example of the three hospitals that I talked about. We did track serious safety events from 2017 to 2023. And you can see, that there was a very huge reduction in those safety events. So of course, being able to demonstrate to hospital administrators the importance of in this way is very powerful. So our board loves looking at serious safety events this way to see, and we've been able to maintain and sustain our gains here for sure. But other things that could be measured: teamwork culture, patient safety culture, near misses, themes identified through root cause analysis, speaking up. There's questionnaires and surveys about pro-social voice and do people feel comfortable speaking up, and even employee engagement. So there are questions related to employee engagement that may be measured and may show some correlation with some of your safety event work or high reliability work. So I know I flew through like about an 8-week course in 45 minutes, but I would just like to open it up to questions now. And if you have any, I'd be happy to talk about some of the experiences we've had or anything else that might be on your mind.
Dr. Leahy, we don't have any questions in the Q&A, but there's a couple of folks in the chat saying that they're already using some of these techniques in their workplaces. I wasn't sure if anyone wanted to come off mute and share a little bit more about that.
I'd be very interested in anybody who's done this work in their organization, for sure.
Maybe feeling a bit shy.
Well, I'll just, I'll ask
Shirley, yeah.
Okay, I do have a question.
Sherri.
Hi, how are you? I loved your class so much, and this is so educational and beneficial. So I am delighted to be here, and I'm honored. You are great.
Oh my goodness, you made my day. Thank you.
So I have a question. How long does it take to implement this? And it's going to be in the form of a program, I can tell. Does it take 10 years, 5, 10 years, or,
I'd be happy to, I can just touch on that because that in itself is a very long presentation, but what it really is a culture change. So as you know, culture change takes time, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but it's not a program. You don't want to present it as a program. You want top leadership, the highest level of leadership, probably the board level. That's what we did, down to the president, down to the senior leaders, saying that they want to minimize errors in their organization. And then all of the rest of it, gets applied over time. So each of those principles might have been 3 months to talk about it, educate about it. And every single employee in our organization went through some training. And every new employee goes through training to learn these things and learn how to practice those things. And there are still many companies who will go out and do this for you. Press Ganey right now is a big player in this field, where for $1 million or so, they'll come out and do it for you. But I believe that, we as leaders, healthcare leaders can do a lot of this work on our own. So I'd say 3 to 5 years, but we started seeing results within a year. I hope that answers your question.
Hi,
So,
can anyone hear me?
yes, hi, Nicole.
Hey, hi. Sorry, I
Hi,
was
Nicole.
having some microphone issues. I was just going to say, we kind of started our HRO journey in 2019. And honestly, I'm not going to lie, for the first year, it really seemed like a lot of skepticism. We had to work very hard at promising that we were going for a just culture and navigating that HRO journey. And so I feel like that first year was kind of the hardest. And then in a couple years, it was very interesting. All of a sudden, our near misses went up by quite a lot. Our reporting increased tremendously, to the point that we had to get quite a bit more safety and QM staff just to help with the reporting system. But our safety events, our big safety events, were going down. So we're kind of finally starting to see the outcome of the HRO journey.
Awesome. That's wonderful to hear. And I think it's unusual, not unusual for a first year skepticism. We did have that as well. We had people saying, well, how come the doctors aren't involved? How come the physicians aren't involved? Medical staff involved. And so we did, and that's a good question. And we did pull in our medical staff, and many of them were trained.
I think a good point too you touched on is sticking up for the safety events. I think sometimes it's hard. We had a meeting where we actually had to practice, and it felt really silly, but we had scenarios like a doctor wasn't in the correct gown, or they're refusing to wash their hands, just simple things. But even practicing, it was so hard to say, hey, Dr. Smith, please do this because it makes this. And when we practiced it, we were like, wow, this is so much harder than we thought it would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when you're saying, I have a safety concern and it's something the physician is doing, and they don't respond in the way that you think that they should. and we ended up leveraging our leadership. Our chief medical officer, our president of the hospital went head to head for high reliability. And after a while, those messages, strong messages from physician leaders and others, really made a difference. And that has to be sustained over a long period of time. And so we're now 8 years into 7 or 8 years into our journey, and that has never changed. That even though the presidents have changed, the way they address it hasn't changed.
Dr. Leahy, do you agree? And I'm saying this more for the DNP students who are here and nurses who are here, that the first step, and one of the things that we talk about in our executive leadership courses, is a just culture. So if people do not feel, if they don't feel safe, if they feel like they're going to get fired if they self-report a mistake or whatever, that this is not going to work. So the big culture shift has got to be from blame of a person to looking at a process problem. And I know that that is a huge step, at least in nursing culture, because nurses are so used to being blamed. And it's just a panic when there's a mistake, when it could be, and just look at the some of the lawsuits that have gone on because a nurse gave a wrong med or, wrong dose. And instead of looking at the process, what led to that, they immediately blame the nurse. So I would just like you to talk for a few minutes on that, about how you think that that fits in with the whole aspect of high reliability organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of nodding heads, and the just culture algorithm is really part of the foundational theory that errors caused by lapses or those types of things are not caused by people. Generally, they're caused by systems. So we did educate everyone on the just culture algorithm. It's actually it's posted on our intranet, and it's used by HR and leaders to evaluate situations to understand better, was this a overt kind of, how it takes you through the different ideas from left to right. And as you go to the right, it's more intentional and might be, there's no more blameless culture. It's a just culture, right? So on the right hand side of this algorithm, talking about things that might require some kind of action. But on the left hand side, these are things that, maybe just have happened because of a mistake that was made, more of a systems error. So that was really a revelation to staff to see that and truly understand, because they didn't even understand the definition of just culture or the idea of just culture. So there was a lot of education around that, including our HR staff who needed to support it and understand it. At that time, we also kind of began to implement things like a second victim program. I'm sure you've heard about that, but those people who did make the mistakes really did need some support. And we, had employee support coordinators, psychologists actually working in the system that could be deployed to address when mistakes happened like this with people. But on the other hand, the people that willfully, good example, fault prevention. If a staff member, if there's a policy in place and protocol that is in place for fault prevention, and it includes that the staff member will not leave someone unattended in the bathroom, and they walk away, and that's then a deviation from a protocol, and it's addressed within that algorithm, the just culture algorithm. So I hope everybody's seen that. If they haven't, we can share that for sure. I hope that answered your question. Very important part of high reliability, very critical, because people, it's a revelation when they see that. They're like, okay, I get it, I understand. It makes complete sense to people when they look at it in that way. So to me, I think it's brilliant.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, it did. Does anyone else have any questions?
There's one in the chat.
Looks like lots of positive
Well,
feedback. And Shirley.
I do agree with Dr. Leahy with what you said with the systemic issues within the organization that a high reliability organization actually needs to be addressed. With that being said, I find that it is very, very difficult. And I agree. For an example, I had a situation where there was someone who was falling and the nurses weren't documenting. And it wasn't being pushed that the documentation, for an example, when did this person fall, at what time? They were documenting after their shift, I guess at the end of their shift, And so by then they've forgotten the exact time. And I was trying to make a protocol so that I want to know what time, when, where, and why. And that seemed to be an issue because it was done a few times. This was during my externship. It was done a few times, and then afterwards kind of dissipated. And I'm asking because this is systemic. Is it due to the fact that during, let's say, what do they call the
Briefing?
No, when they have the yearly, every 14 months, they have the yearly survey.
Appraisals? Oh.
Yeah, the surveyors, when the surveys come and they look at that, is it something that's held against the facility? Is this so systemic that the facility is afraid that if CMS sees that this facility has this issue and they're not mitigating falls, does it count against the facility? I was trying to figure out, why aren't these people really working together to see why? When this person, it seemed to me to be so simple. Just find out when that person falls, and they're probably falling at the same time. Maybe they're getting up and after lunch or something like that, and they're falling. What time? So that you can actually have people working and watching out for that person, and maybe just dropping in the room, putting something on the door that says, okay, fall risk at this time, look at this person, check in on them. And no one did that. So I just chopped it up for her.
You bring up a really good, so I know we're almost at time, but I do want to make this point that I really believe that situations like this, and there's a million of situations like this, things happen and they don't seem right, and people, I'm sure you've read about normalization of deviance, where it becomes normal, becomes part of just how we do things. We don't report right away. We don't do this. We don't do that. That's the culture. And so that is not going to change unless there is a culture change that makes that not okay to do anymore. So whether it's a fall or an error or just the way people treat each other, even those things are, and I would recommend that you all, maybe read an article about organizational culture. That's my background. And I think it's just the bottom line with everything, that if the culture in an organization, it could be a toxic culture, or it could be a culture of high reliability. I mean, you've got to realize that these things, somebody has allowed these things to happen, and it is very hard to change it. And if you're a new leader in one of those organizations, you can have a foundation that you go in and at least make a micro change or make a change within the scope of your work group or your people. But there's a lot to be said about high reliability as a way to change culture. So if I'm sure you have lots of questions, and it's definitely not easy, but I hope I've sparked your curiosity at least to read more and try to understand how it might explain things. So Shirley, you said something, it seems like it should be so easy. Yeah, do you remember when we tried to get everyone to wear masks a couple of years ago? Do you know how, does anybody have some horror stories about how our own staff didn't want to wear masks in the beginning of COVID? And especially, or visitors, people who were coming in, then even after all this had happened. So small changes, small things are nothing is easy. Even small things are difficult. So anyway, I hope that you all I think we're out of time, but you can also feel free to reach out to me through the NU email, Sherri.Leahy S.Leahy@nu.edu. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So please feel free just to shoot me an email. Happy to talk with you offline for sure. Anything else I've missed?
No, thank you so much, Dr. Leahy. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is recorded, so I will be sending out the recording. Give me about 24 hours to get that out to you all.